This is chapter 17 of The God Boy by Ian Cross. You like the bike I gave you? That was the first thing Dad said to me when he saw me. He was sitting on a chair in the kitchen as though he was about to fall off it. His face was so red, and it looked as though it had leaked over into his eyes. I'd been laying on my bed since I got home because I wasn't feeling well, and didn't want to be seen. Mum thought I was reading and didn't bother me till tea was ready at about 7 o'clock. That's when I went along to the kitchen. Because I know now what was about to happen to him. I feel sorry for Dad. If he really did come from such a high and mighty family, if he really did own a lot of racehorses when he was young and was a great friend of famous people, he must have been sorry for himself too. The depression really was to blame, I suppose. Dad always spoke of the depression as though it was a horrible disease that had nearly killed him. Everything that happened to him, he once told me, was caused by the depression, and Mum. The depression must have been worse than war, because he always seemed pleased with himself when he talked about the First World War, in spite of the fact that once he told me that it was in some hand-to-hand fighting there that his arm had been mangled. Even during the last war, when I was only a kid, I can remember him getting excited and talking about it as though it was a wonderful thing. And after that war was over, he was all for getting stuck into Russia. The filthy communists should be wiped off the map, he said. We've cleaned up Hitler, so we might as well wipe the floor with Stalin while we're at it. I wouldn't mind getting into that fight myself if I wasn't too old. Yet now and then he would talk about the depression, and he would be very different. I hope you never have to live through another depression, Jimmy, he would say. It ruined your father. So you see, when I say that the depression was worse than the war, I know what I'm talking about, even if I'm not sure of the exact details. I will always see Dad as he was sitting in that chair in the kitchen, with his black shoes unlaced and with the tongues pulled up so that they would be more comfortable, his legs sagging out at the knees, pulling his trousers way up over his socks, showing his hairy calves, the top of his trousers unbuttoned and his braces unhitched, his waistcoat open, his collar and tie off, his right arm holding over the back of the chair, allowing him to hang forward. If it hadn't been for that arm holding him, I'm darn sure he would have flopped right over. The breath was coming out of his mouth and nose as though he was blowing and sucking, and his face, besides being so damn red, was puffed and sweating. Boy, he was drunk. I'd got so that I could smell beer on Dad a mile off. I could have smelled it then from 100 miles away. Yet he spoke quite clearly, which still puzzles me. Usually he got his words mixed up and slurred, yet this time, though, he was the worst I'd ever seen him. He sounded as clear as a bell. You like that bike I gave you? He said. I was stiff and sore. That business in the afternoon, and the bashing from Bloody Jack had taken all the stuffing out of me. Yet it had made me nearly forget about the trouble of the morning. Now my forgetting was all over, and I started to feel cold. I looked at Mum as she was dishing out a stew from the pot on the stove, although I didn't need to look to know how she was feeling. I've forgotten to wash my hands, I said, turning back and going out of the kitchen. I was afraid that I would have one of my queer turns in front of them. I don't suppose there was any danger, really, but I went to the bathroom and washed myself with hot water, said a Hail Mary and sang It's a Long Way to Tipperary as I dried myself as a precaution. Dad heard me singing because he started up on the same song himself and kept it up until I got back. That's a great old song you're trying to sing, Jimmy, and I'm glad you're so happy to sing a great old song like that. Why are you singing, eh? Mum put the plates on the table as he was talking, gave a hiss like a railway engine blowing off steam, and then glared at him. She didn't say a word. That did it for me. Suddenly everything inside me, inside my head and body, just lay down. It was as though what was me had been held up by a piece of string which had snapped and let me fall. It was a wonderful feeling, honestly. A little like the way you get when you're in a hot bath too long. I couldn't even care or worry if I tried. If a pin had been stuck into me, I probably wouldn't have felt it. I was singing because I was singing, I suppose, I said to Dad. He sat up in his chair and pulled it over to his place at the table. You're happy, Jimmy. Old boy, that's why you sing, because you're happy. Your old dad made you happy with that bike, and don't you worry. Your old dad is going to do lots of things for you, old son. He's going to see that you get a chance he didn't have, and he's going to see that you don't get the rotten luck he had. You can't keep a Sullivan down because they didn't really lick your old man, no sir. They just gave him rotten luck and smashed him up and tied him to a she-devil. They didn't lick him, by God, no. They held him down, and they'll have to keep holding me down, but he'll not give in, no sir. They'll have to hold him down till the day he dies. And by God, I bet they do hold him down, not giving him a chance. I shoveled my stew down, not bothering to look up. I was on one side of the table, Mum was on the other side, and Dad sat at the top talking his head off as though it was somebody else and nothing to do with me. I felt Mum getting boiling mad. I felt it, yet I didn't care, except for the time she was at the stove. I hadn't even looked at her, and I wasn't going to either. Sure, I take a few drinks, son, Dad said. I take a few drinks, and I can hold my drinks, as I've been around, and no gentleman ever gets so drunk he can't control himself, so you never have to be ashamed of me, not in your sweet life you don't. You don't have to be ashamed of me. Don't I see that you get what you need, and a good bike, that is, too? As good as any boy your age in this town or anywhere in the country. By God, I can still see that my son gets a fair deal. He can't stop me from doing that, no sir, and I'll see that you don't get tied up with the wrong kind of woman, if it is the last thing I do. There are lots of ignorant slobs of women waiting to get their clutches on you, and when they do, they turn their filthy backs on you, and what you do is you give them a boot in their backsides if you are a man, and you will be the man because you're a Sullivan. I kept scooping the food into my mouth, staring hard at the stuff as it came into my mouth on the fork, and when Mum whispered, "If you don't stop that, I'll kill you," I wasn't even surprised. It was as though I had heard her say it before she actually spoke. Dad's voice was still as clear as a bell, except that it seemed to have faded, and he said, "I'm talking to my son, woman, so you keep your mouth shut." Mum said something else that I didn't quite hear. Then Dad whispered again from a long way away. I tried to jiggle my brain along so that I could hear them, but the effort was too much. I was tired out, and instead of not being able to keep my eyes open the way it usually is when you are that far gone, I couldn't keep my ears listening. Their voices were there, yet they sounded so light that as soon as they reached me, they were gone before I could actually hear the words. A sort of happiness filled me up, the way it does when you are 3/4 asleep, warm in bed, and drifting around all over the place as though you're floating. All I could see, too, was my plate and my knife and my fork in my hands silently moving. I dropped my knife without a sound and shifted the fork over to my right hand and scooped the last of the stew into my mouth. I could see the thin crack on the plate, and I stared at it till it wriggled. I took a deep breath and looked up, and I think I said, "I'm tired now, and I want to go to bed." That's what I meant to say, and my lips moved and my voice must have sounded, yet the words were swallowed up into thin air. The skin on Mum's face was somehow stretched so tight that it looked as though the bones underneath were going to burst out. Her shoulders were hunched up, her eyes were shining, her nose was white and her lips yellow, and there were black stretched lines on her neck. I didn't care. Dad was ticking his head from side to side, and all the red in his face and eyes were bright as new paint, and he had the smile with his lips pulled back and set as though they were always like that, never shifting, and somehow I could see he was in some kind of happiness too. He looked as though he was doing what he had always wanted to do. All I could do was see, and that is what I saw. Dad glowing as if he was heading for the winning post 100 yards ahead of anybody else, and it was something to do with my mother wound up so tight and hard that all her skin was stretched. I didn't care how they looked though, and after I had said what I thought I said, and both their lips moved, I got around from behind the table and went to the door and closed it behind me. The lock clicked so loudly and my ears jumped in an awful ache that was gone before I could even feel it, and all the faraway things rushed in close to me again. From the other side of the door I heard him say, "I've got you, and when I've finished with you, it'll be back into the gutter." The air moved in closer to me too, and became colder and colder as my heart began to thump harder and harder. I turned down toward the bathroom and ran to turn the tap on before I exploded. I was careful not to sing too loudly this time. That night I had the only dream I ever remembered completely afterwards. I must have gone to sleep as soon as I was in bed, because I remember nothing until I walked into this huge spider web that stretched from the earth to the sky. At first I enjoyed myself, pulling at the strands that were as thick as ropes, and watching the whole web shiver and shake for as far as I could see, miles and miles up and around myself. But when I tried to go away, the web stuck to my hands and legs, and the ropes shriveled up until they were thin and cold. Then I was slowly lifted up until my feet were off the ground, and my arms were stretched wide out. There was a tugging at my wrists. I tried to struggle and kick my way out, but it was no use. I let myself hang and waited. The whole web bounced as though some huge creature had landed on the outer edge on a lot of different legs. The strands that held me started to hum like telegraph wires in a high wind, and slowly I could feel this big thing feel its way toward me. I tore at my arms and legs to try and get free. "Let me go! Let me go!" I screamed at the top of my voice, and the web began to jump up and down like crazy as this thing got nearer. "Let me go, please!" I yelled again, and then started saying, "Please, please!" over and over again. A light flashed in my eyes, and a voice called to me, "Jimmy, it's all right." And the light flashed off and on, each time stronger, until my eyes were wide open to it, and stinging, and slowly seeing a big figure, coming into shape. "You've had a bad dream, son, that's all," the voice said. It was Mum. She was standing at the foot of the bed. It was such a huge relief seeing her there. "You've overtired yourself on that bike," she said, "and you've had a bad dream. That is all over now. It's all over now." "I'm sorry," I said. "Back to sleep, boy. And what have you got your arms stretched out like that for?" "Silly. Tuck them back under the blankets." I turned over on my side and pulled my arms against my chest and felt her hands pull the blankets over my shoulders tightly and shove the ends hard under the mattress, so hard that I was pushed up and dropped down again. I meant to ask her what time it was, but all I could raise was a mumble, and I didn't feel like trying again. And then it came to me that she had her clothes on. I was going to ask her why she was dressed, but when I opened my eyes again and the light had been turned off, she had gone. And when I woke up in the morning, her being dressed was the first thought I had. It was strange because for all I knew, it might have been very early in the night when she had come into my bedroom, and as she wouldn't have gone to bed, then it was natural that she would still have her clothes on. Yet I was worried. I kicked back my blankets and went over the whole business, even the bad dream I'd had, and thought of the blurred way Mum looked at me after I had half wakened up. It came to me in one big bang, of course. She had different clothes on from what she had been wearing at tea time the night before. I stopped worrying about it all then,